Hello and welcome to this Real Python video course on how to convert a Python string to an int. In this course, you're going to take a look at how to represent integers in Python, how to convert a Python string to an int, and how to convert a Python int to a string. Let's get started. Representing integers in Python. Firstly, a quick refresher. What is an integer? An integer is a whole number, and by whole number we mean it has no fractional or decimal component. An integer can be stored using different types. Two possible Python data types for representing an integer are, firstly, a string, secondly, an int. Let's take a look at those. Firstly, you can represent an integer using a string literal using the notation shown below. You can see it's been assigned with 110 in quotes. This could be single or double quotes. Here, Python understands you want to store the integer 110 as a string. You can do the same with the integer data type, as seen here. Notice there are no quotes around the number. It's important to consider what you specifically mean by 110 in quotes and 110 without the quotes in the examples above. As a human who's used the decimal number system for your whole life, it might be obvious to you that you mean the number 110. However, there are several other number systems, such as binary and hexadecimal, which use different bases to represent an integer. Let's take a look at that base system using the Python REPL. Here I'm going to be using bpython as it color codes the output, but the standard Python REPL will work in exactly the same way. So we've assumed that the numbers 110 mean decimal 110. But in Python we can prefix this number with different codes to tell Python to use different number bases. So by typing 0b before our number, we can see this actually represents 6 in binary. We have 14, 12 and no units. Doing the same in octal with an O leads us to the value 72, as we have 164, 18, and again no units. Doing the same in hexadecimal with an X gives us the value 272. Here we have 256, a 16, and once more no units. If there's no prefix present, int will assume that the number will be decimal. Placing the prefix allows int to understand the number that we want. However, if we don't use the prefix, we'll generate a syntax error. String representations do not suffer from this. Because strings hold arbitrary text data. Now that you have some foundational knowledge about how to represent integers using string and int data types, you'll learn how to convert a Python string to an int. Converting a Python string to an int. If you have a decimal integer represented as a string and you want to convert the Python string to an int, then you can just pass the string to int, which returns a decimal integer. Here you can see the variable s has been defined as the string 110. Returning that shows that it's a string with the quotes, and if we want the integer version of that, we can see that that's returned as an integer without any quotes around it. We can check the type of that output using type. As you can see, it's of class int. By default, int assumes that the string argument represents a decimal integer. If you pass the wrong kind of data to it, this can lead to some confusion if you've not been fully aware of the types of numbers you're passing to it. As you can see, trying to pass it a hexadecimal number here has generated a value error. The error message says the string is not a valid decimal integer. It's important to recognize the difference between two types of failed results of passing a string to int. Firstly, let's look at a logical error, where int does know how to pass the string, but not in the way we expected. Here's a string that's intended to be binary, but int will misinterpret it. In this example, the intended result was 210, the decimal representation of that binary string. Unfortunately, because that behavior wasn't specified, int assumed the string was a decimal integer and produced the result seen on screen. A good safeguard for this behavior is to always define any string representation using explicit bases. However, passing our new binary string to int leads to the value error we saw before. If you pass a string to int which is not in decimal, you can specify the number using the base argument as seen here. Finally, the correct result is obtained. Int has understood you're passing a binary string and expecting a decimal integer. Note that the value for the base argument is not limited to 2, 8, 10 and 16, the number bases we've seen so far, but can be any arbitrary number. Now that you're comfortable with the ins and outs of converting Python strings to ints, you'll learn how to do the inverse operation in the next section. Converting a Python int to a string. In Python, you can convert a Python int to a string using str, as seen here. As you can see, I is an integer, and we can obtain the string representation as seen here. You can see that I is of class int, and the string representation is indeed a string. By default, this behaves like int in that it results in a decimal representation. In this example, it's smart enough to interpret the binary literal and convert it to a decimal string. If you want a string to represent an integer in another number system, then you can use a formatted string, such as an f string in Python 3.6 and later, and an option that specifies the base, as seen here. So as you can see, the octal variable represents 571 in decimal, and we can specify a different base, as seen here. Using the :x representation has converted to hexadecimal, and using :b has converted the number to binary. This gives a flexible way to represent an integer in a variety of different number systems. Congratulations! You've learnt so much about integers and how to represent and convert them between Python string and int data types. In this course, you learned how to use str and int to store integers, how to specify an explicit number system for an integer representation, how to convert a Python string to an int, and how to convert a Python int to a string. We hope you found this useful, and we'll see you again soon at realpython.com.